been a great relationship with Pat and Heidi over the years, and I know some of the people in the room, most are new to me today. I'm a former member of a group known as Church of the Living Word. It was also known as The Walk. When I joined it, it was affiliated with what was known as the Latter-Rain Movement. At that time, I didn't know anything about the Latter-Rain Movement. I had been introduced to the Jesus people, or the Jesus Movement, connected with Calvary Chapel and Chuck Smith back in 1971. And I remember when I was learning things back then in the New Testament, and I've been brought up in a mainstream Protestant type background, Lutheran and Methodist. I was confirmed as a Methodist and, went through confirmation classes and things of this nature. So, I did have some Bible knowledge, but when I encountered Pentecostal and charismatic believers, I was learning other things I didn't know before. But that also was sort of a stepping stone, because what was very important about the Latter-Rain Movement is their concept of the restoration of apostles and prophets for today. So the founding apostle of the group of the Church of the Living Word was John Robert Stevens. William Branham, to my understanding, actually laid hands on him. He's a founding father. I liken him to the George Washington of the Latter-Rain Movement because of his signs and wonders, and especially his healing meetings. In fact, he laid hands on Oral Roberts, if you're familiar with Oral Roberts. He died not too long ago, a number of years now, but, he was a faith healer. And so this arena really opened me up spiritually to a lot of things. The academic side of learning things, like, Bible studies and things where it's more, you're intellectually involved with it. Of course, it relates to you personally, but the shift for me personally and being open to a group like this was mystical in nature, supernatural in nature. The dunamis, the power of God, that sort of thing. And with the Jesus movement, it embraced Christian denominations, for example, Baptist, Methodist, you name it. There was a very, in some cases, Roman Catholics came. But the reason I mention that is there was this open church approach towards being inclusive in that sense. My experience in the Church of the Living Word, or the Walk, was quite different. It was exclusive in the sense that they had this concept of the old order. That was the terminology that was in the group that I was in. But it's also a familiar term if you're familiar with the Latter-Rain Movement and its history. So the denominations were more associated with Babylon. Now, if you're familiar with end-time prophecy, so I remember reading The Late Great Planet Earth, and I had totally absorbed that book, and I was really on fire, and those days were the last days. But Chuck Smith, Dave Hunt, there's a number of them. Back in the 70s we're talking. There was, concern whether Henry Kissinger was the Antichrist or not back in those days. So the tribulation period was something that was thematically a big thing. But Walk was very interesting because they believed we were in the end times, but they did not take the Darby Schofield approach towards that. And what I mean by that is the dispensations, like God works in specific dispensations. The law, for example, with Moses, the period of grace is the church age that we live in to this present time. The kingdom message was a distinctive, though, and there's various type of groups that have this as, they refer to it as the gospel of the kingdom. Now, the thing that's challenging about that was very baffling for me while I was in the walk was, what's the gospel of grace versus the gospel of the kingdom? I mean, what is the distinctions that they're making there? It wasn't easy to get access to that because you had to go to higher levels of what they call revelation. Another thing that they emphasized was that it had to be a revelation to me. God had to be speaking to me directly. So it wasn't just a matter of reading the letter. And one of the common verses that the group would go to is, the letter killeth, but the spirit giveth life. And so the frame of reference that was developing from that was a much more mystical relationship to those that were in authority above me. Now what they did is they had a pyramid structure towards, what that meant in terms of apostles and prophets for today. So there was this new divine order that was being established that was different than your Presbyterian church down the street, were congregational churches, the way that they would decide things. And so one of the things that you get with Restoration Movement type organizations is what they call the great falling away. You know, the denominations are really aligned with all of that. Now, out there you have good denominations and you have bad denominations. You have those that are faithful to biblical truth, and you have those that have quite a mixture, and then you have others that have gone the liberal wing of things. And some into outright apostasy. They don't believe in the bodily resurrection of Jesus. They wouldn't hold to the virgin birth. But the interesting thing about the taco mix, when you run into it, is that they will hold to a lot of the central truths of the Christian faith. They would believe that Jesus is divine. Many of them would not have an issue with the Trinity. Some extreme groups that are anti-Trinitarian are very extreme about that, and they're very hostile to it. So, since I have a PowerPoint set up, I should continue with the... This was a conference that I attended in 1972 with Underground Evangelism. And we met people who were involved with the walk, but I didn't know it at the time of the conference. I came later through a relationship. Her name was Wendy, who was involved, with ongoing communication. One of the guys that was a member of this group worked for the telephone company. And so he did call from the West Coast and spent a lot of time on the phone, and you didn't have those expensive long-distance charges, which were heavy back then in those days. So the relationship was critical because the trust bond started. And so Winnie was invited to a wedding. And so she went out there. Paul was related to a woman that was in the Campus Crusade for Christ. Now, the other guy was not a member of the Church of the Living Word, but Ralph was. So Winnie brought back teaching materials with her, and one of the booklets was called The New Testament Church. And in this outline form, if you go from beginning to end, by the time you get to the end of it, you would end up leaving any church that you belong to, and you would be joining that group. And that's what I have found common with many taco groups, is that at the beginning, there is a come to a Bible study. There is a relational side of really connecting with people personally. And so the friendship is really an issue. And the distinctive here, and it relates to my exit counseling work, is that if you have a genuine relationship with somebody that's spontaneous, that's one thing, that's natural. It's another thing when a group sets the recruiter up. And one of the terminologies you might have heard of is love bombing. In other words, there's a concerted effort to get the trust of the person in the relationship so that they will come to the studies, and in those studies over a period of time, you will separate from any other previous spiritual or religious commitment you may have had to another organization. I find this troubling, the families that call me, because a lot of them that I've worked with come from Bible-believing families. I've worked with families where the father was a head of a seminary or a missions location that he was located in some other part of the world. Roman Catholic families will call, and they will experience total separation. People will get rebaptized. So why I'm bringing this up in terms of the bonding that goes on at the beginning is an important thing. One of the things that I do with religion work, how did this person come into a relationship with the taco, for example, or a cult group, so that you can determine what is the influence that's at work. It's one thing when you can be sincerely motivated, but it's important to understand the influences that are associated with it. At the time I encountered this, I did not know I was joining a cult group. I didn't know it. But one of the things that was really important about my contact with this, it was a new learning curve that I was experiencing. The restoration of apostles and prophets caught my attention. I'll ask you a question. How many people know the name of the New Testament prophet that's in the New Testament? Can I see a show of hands? Okay. Agabus. If I asked everybody in this room, do you know who Agabus is? He's a New Testament prophet. I didn't know that. I thought, wow. And then they were showing me things about apostleship that would not have come through my normal denominational kind of exposure in Sunday school, or even just listening to a sermon. Just didn't get into that kind of detail about the history of apostles that I didn't know much about, like Barnabas, for example. He's mentioned in the New Testament. He's considered an apostle. But one of the things that took place, and this is why the original Greek and Hebrew in the scripture is a big deal when you're dealing with these kinds of matters, is that apostle is defined in a specific way in the New Testament. I'm going to touch on this because it's very important to know the distinction between a true biblical leader and the qualifications that Scripture talks about versus one that claim the same thing. And they really don't meet the biblical standards or the qualifications that Scripture itself requires. It's a very serious area. What I found in my experience was when I started to embrace these false apostles, thinking that they were biblical type apostles, I didn't know the difference between a true and a false apostle. I could not discern that, not that long being out of high school when it started for me. So the openness that I had to what I was learning, and a big part of it was a new learning curve. And just examine your own experience in terms of whatever group you were exposed to. Was it new information that you were getting from them that you didn't get from other sources? Spiritually, in some way, it was connecting for you. Like it was something meaningful. You really felt like God was behind that. After I left my group, I was exposed to other organizations, and my friends were being recruited. I went undercover with Temple University. That's me back in my 20s. But these are my friends that were with me. And so I had a Christian friend who was in journalism school at the time at Temple University. And he asked me to go undercover, and that's the Unification Church, or the Moonies. And that's a picture they put there. I took of the Carp Center in Philadelphia. So I actually went through some of the Mooney training that they had back then. And one of the things that was interesting about the divine principle is they quoted a lot of the Bible in it. The problem was there was a lot of stuff that they didn't quote. And one of the most powerful pieces of information, and I still use it if I need to do so, is with the Unification Church when they had their mass weddings. I went to the one in New York at Madison Square Garden, which wasn't unusual when Moon was alive, and he'd actually be there. But we had a track from the Spiritual Counterfeits Project, and it took the divine principle and compared it with specific passages in the Bible, specifically, doctrine for doctrine. Very important thing if you're able to do that with your own group, if you can compare things like that. But what it did show me, even though the doctrines were diverse, characteristics within these groups were similar. And that's the thing that's really important about the commonality of the characteristics of the traits. And the Spiritual Counterfeits Project wrote in the late 70s an article called John Robert Stevens, Church of the Living Word. This was the first published piece of literature I ever encountered on my own group. I heard Brooks Alexander and Houston Hall at the University of Pennsylvania back in 1974, and this came out 2 years later. But the thing that was very interesting about this article is that they talk about at the beginning, in order to discover the doctrinal deviations, you might have to look at the behavior first, because it directs you to what some of those deficiencies may be. So the thing that struck me about dealing with other groups beside my own, I began to see that there were similarities in those characteristics. And I came across two things, because since 1976 is when I began my formal training in seminary in Philadelphia. And I was really getting equipped with the apologetic tools. What's very important about that is I was systematically learning church history. When I did that, I realized I was being indoctrinated in the group I was in. They were selecting things, or we might call it cherry picking, and arranging them in a certain way. Very compelling and convincing if that's all you're working from. And the other thing is what a group does to insulate you from outside information. One of the fundamental things that takes place when you go through the indoctrination process is the critical thinking part of you is affected. And another thing is spirituality. A lot of times you trust if you believe it's coming directly from God. Now in the scripture, you have to really carefully qualify what comes from God and what doesn't come from God. And a Christian apologetic training helps you sort out and discern this. And I'm going to cover some of those key areas today, hopefully. This was the leader of my group, but this came from their website: spiritual father, church founder, servant of God, visionary apostle, prophet, leader, brother, and friend. So notice all that encapsulates. And you'll find the current legacy, and I've had people tell me that Francis Frangipane doesn't acknowledge his association with this group. I remember him when I was in my group. And I had Bob Lico, who's a specialist in this area with the latter rain. He was getting telephone calls, and people were saying that he was having difficulty that Frangipane was associated with. I said, I know people that know when he was there historically. So knowing the history of a group is really important, especially things that they may not be including in their history. So those are founding leaders. There's a book out. Did I bring it? Yeah, I do have it with me. It's called Vengeance is Ours. And it's a book that I recommend if you're interested in the Latter Rain movement and the New Apostolic Reformation. Some people will be affected by this, others won't, but I do believe it's a worthwhile book to read if you don't know the full history of what this movement is. This book, if I had had it back in 1971, I probably would have left within 2 weeks, knowing what was in the history. Versus, I learned the hard way much later, through a lot of laboring efforts to figure out what is this movement and how does it work. There's different types of groups, and I mentioned that. You have Eastern mystical groups, and so they have a certain appeal to them. Not every type of group appeals to people. There's a particular type of group that has a connection with them. And these are visuals to just give you examples of that. This is the one we're probably most familiar with, what's called Bible-based or aberrant Christian. I heard the meaning of the word taco. It's, and even Waco is related to some elements of that. And I mentioned the pyramid structure. The authority structure within many of these groups has an authoritarian hierarchy to it. This is David Koresh from Waco. And there in the corner is Jim Jones, who was the founding pastor of the People's Temple. You know, he was involved with the Disciples of Christ denomination. He was never defrocked. In other words, they didn't remove him from his pastorate. And then you have close to 1,000 people, 900 and some, 38 I think it is, or at least 918 people died in Jonestown, Diana. And that's the picture of them there to the mass suicide. So to what extreme will things go? Back in the 90s, we had David Koresh. His name is Vernon Howell. Now, if you're familiar with the Seventh-day Adventists and their messenger relationship, you know, God has messenger. I talked to the Davidians directly when I met them in Waco. And they all had that consistent thing about him, that he had the message. If you're trained in your group that a messenger is necessary in order to hear God's voice for today, there's a whole criteria that goes with that teaching that they're giving you, and they felt that he met it. And then he predicted back in 1993, even when we had that snow yesterday, well, he talked about the blizzard of 93, he saw that as an apocalyptic sign. So when he became the authority figure, David Koresh, in relationship to the Lamb that's worthy to open up the 7 seals of the book of Revelation, he claimed he had the authority, and he started with the first one when he let people out, when he let the children out, and he let the secretary of the group, Catherine, out. She brought that one seal being open message, and he wanted to open all 7 on them. Only Jesus is qualified to do this in the New Testament. But nonetheless, that's how far these deviations can go. Then you have ones that wouldn't be necessarily associated with theology. But if you look at psycho-spiritual or self-improvement groups, some of them do have spiritual underpinnings. Eastern mysticism or occult metaphysics. And I'll touch on some of those categories. But so the self-improvement or therapy groups can have these sort of dynamics about them. This is another type of group where you have a combination of Eastern and Western traditions in their teaching. In Denver, in this Colorado area, you may come across quite a bit of it. The harmony concept in spirituality, the inclusiveness. So you have this, this idea of traditions from East and West blend together, but you also have authoritarian leaders who are at the top. They're the ones that claim to be the revelator. They're the ones that are in touch with the Great White Brotherhood in the Teton Mountains, and they communicate with them, and they have messages from them. So the concept of authority is a big thing when you're dealing with this kind of spirituality, especially if you trust the leader or the founder, that their ultimate pronouncements are ultimate truth. Whether it's in the Bible or not, these groups, the Bible's okay, but you blend that in with the Bhagavad Gita, you blend that in with other spiritual authoritative texts that they would hold to, and then you get that blend and that mixture. This is not so much oriented towards theology, but there are wings of it that do. In fact, if you look at the roots of the Latter Rain movement, and it's maybe the Aryan nations or the Great White Brotherhood, that's connected with what's called the Manifest Sons of God teaching. Now that's something they had in common. When Timothy McVeigh got involved with the Davidians in Waco, he had a relationship with this Aryan past. And so he was connected with the Patriot movement. And the Patriot movement had elements of the neo-Nazis that were connected to some of those things. And so there was this racial doctrine involved. Political groups can get into this kind of ideology. A historical example of that is the Nazis in Germany. The more contemporary ones, now you have what's called neo-Nazis. The Aryan groups can blend with Nazi philosophy. Okay, the atheistic blend of things. So you have political groups that don't claim theology at all, but they have the cult-like dynamic about them. So the dynamics are important as well as the content. These are pyramid sales organizations. That they tend to do a lot of heavy recruiting. A basic form of that is if you go to one of their workshops. And so they recruit you, and then they get you into the sales end of it, is selling to others. But there's a pyramid system to it. And this is an interesting book. It's called Amway, The Cult of Free Enterprise. This was authored by a former distributor who actually worked within that corporation. And multiplication, if you've ever heard of the Boston Church of Christ or International Church of Christ, they had that multiplication system. Here's the idea. You can evangelize the world within 32 years. You're talking, Christianity's been in existence for over 2,000 years. Now we're talking, you can start a discipling movement. And that's the way the shepherding discipling movement starts. And then you go through this multiplying process in discipling others. And they make this parallel between Jesus and the disciples, the disciple and the discipler, equating the two together. Now, Jesus was God. We're not God. So the authority issue is a very serious parallel that's being made, especially if you get the cloning process that comes out at the other end. But the thing I want to get to in terms of the discipling methodology is if according to them, through their it's like cell multiplication in a way. If you did that within 32 years, you could evangelize the world. Do you realize the incredible pressure that puts on the individual disciple in order to meet those standards? That is pressure. I've worked with people that couldn't take it. I've worked with them in mental hospitals. I've seen them have they've had nervous breakdowns. Some people can go through suicidal battles. It's very serious on a psychological level when those type of pressures are relentless. And the sacrificial giving involved. I know people that would sell everything, their wedding ring, you name it. And they would be eating popcorn for dinner because they were sacrificially giving for this kind of work. I mean, it's a very powerful thing. Then you have the New Age or UFO type groups. And there's quite a few of those. I mean, your Heaven's Gate was a good example of that. The people that died in San Diego, believing that the comet Hale-Bopp, when it came, that it was their time to go, that they were going to rejoin the Space Brother kind of relationships. And that took a lot to get them to that state. I personally know families that were affected by that group, that their loved ones ended up joining that effort. And then the occult satanic, there are the Luke Charest and the Anton LaVey, the Church of Satan. You have followers that still continue those type of teachings, and it tends to be more secretive. It's not always easy to join those type of groups, and that's to most Christians this would be obvious. They wouldn't get involved in something like this. But people that are recruited into these things through the internet, The rise in paganism has been just incredible with the advent of the internet. When you look at the entertainment industry and all this occult-related stuff that they crank out, you got a lot of curious young minds that start dabbling in this material. And there is a certain percentage that do get snagged by it. I have worked with people that have really lived this out. You know, all this zombie stuff you see all over the place in the media these days. It creates curiosity in young people to venture into this type of spirituality. And so when you examine the history of cult leaders in the United States, with the exception of Eastern cults, you get, like there's a psychological structure to it. I went through some of the leaders, so I won't review that part of it, but I do want to get into the psychological structure of cultism. Now this book that I have up on the screen is not the original Kingdom of the Cults. That's the first one that he published. It's chapter 3 in that book. This was the second one. This one had a full chapter on the group I was in. Again, it was the first major evangelical Christian book on this topic that had a full chapter on the Church of the Living Word. So, but one of the things that he points out, and I want to go over that, and I've written some things from that chapter, so I'd like to go to it and just give it to you. The founders define what a group is. The leaders are the ones that have the rules. They're the ones that are in charge of what the teaching is and what it means. Another one was Moses David Berg, who was the founder of the Children of God. He came out of a Christian Missionary Alliance background. Victor Paul Wierwille of the Way International was a Reformed pastor, according to Harold Roussel in his seminal article in Christianity Today. So you'll find very interesting histories with some of the leaders of the groups that were, especially the taco ones. Yeah, Dr. Walter Martin, author of the book Kingdom of the Cults, in chapter 3 of his book, The Psychological Structure of Cultism, observed, first and foremost, the belief system of the cults are characterized by closed-mindedness. Such belief systems are in isolation and lack logical consistency. This is going to cause biblical issues, and I'm going to touch on this later. They exist in what we might describe as separate compartments in the cultist mind and are almost incapable of penetration. That's when I encounter an intervention, is the compartmentalization. For example, a person can be on the job and they're very skilled at what they do. That's not threatening to teaching, policy, or rules. They can do quite well with all that. The other thing is if the group is against it, for example, my group, if they labeled it Babylon, you didn't want to have anything to do with it. That was a big negative, spiritually speaking especially. Why should I go out there and work for Babylon and they get my money? I really should be devoting this to God's kingdom. The group gets a lot of money when you have that type of teaching over your thinking. So he talks about the ability to address that. I found this true in my own work, in that if I can have common ground where I can share things, the person at least will listen with respect because they recognize the similarity. So when you get into differences, is how you process that difference is the big part of this, and I'll try to go through what that means. Secondly, the closed-minded belief systems are characterized by a genuine antagonism on a personal level on those who do not agree with the group teaching and leadership decisions. That's really important if you're dealing with relationships. If you have loved ones that are in this type of thing, be mindful of this dynamic, because it affects the relationship. The communication part of it's really important. If you can use words that are not threatening or polarizing, especially if they have black and white doctrine about certain things, understand that that's the way the doctrine works, so that you can not trigger them in a negative way. The surrender of individual autonomy and decisions to the cult leaders produces group members who suffer from impairment in personal choices and thinking critically, especially when the cult is wrong. A repeated teaching throughout various latter-rain groups is that you must obey your leaders even if they're wrong. The shepherding and discipleship thing taught the same thing. Now there are biblical injunctions against that, and I want to cover some Bible verses that address that. But that's a serious surrender of autonomy. It's also a serious surrendering of your critical thinking and discernment judgment. It really is. Because you must obey even if they're wrong, because God will bless you for your obedience. Another concept that you will get in many of the legalistic type groups is that they will liken their leaders unto Moses. Moses was called, he was the lawgiver. In John chapter 1 we had Moses came with the law, Jesus Christ came full of grace and truth. So at least we have this comparison of the two great covenants in that type of relationship. The thing that's really important when a group starts arguing its authority based on the theocracy concepts of the Old Testament is different than the institution that Jesus set up. Now, do we know of any of the apostles going around beating the bushes, burning witches? Can you think of one example of an apostle doing anything like that? We don't have that. The institution that Jesus created functions differently than the theocracy of, say, King Saul or David with a sword and going out there executing people. You don't see apostles carrying out warfare in that way. The leaders in the early church, the bishops, the deacons, you look at it. It's not exercised in the same way as you have in the theocracy, where you had God, who was the lawgiver, then he charged people to carry out the legal edicts that he commanded. And then you had this government concept, that the kings had the authority from God to exercise in the nation of Israel, for example. The church structure is really different, and there are negative prohibitions in the scripture of using authority wrongly. In other words, the Bible forbids the misuse of certain kinds of authority, especially when you're talking about spiritual leaders. People who submit to the group teachings when they're inside of it believe that they must do so because God requires that of them. So the concept that the leader is like unto Moses, that you have to have God's man speaking to you directly. And in certain cases, they say that they heard angels speak to them. Branham had an angel stand by his side when he would give certain pronouncements and healings. And other leaders do a very similar thing when it comes to what we call mystical manipulation. In other words, the Bible itself doesn't say this, but the person who's in charge or who is in authority, God speaks directly through them. And once they cross the line of God speaking to them, then you have to look at what are the qualifications that God requires when he claims he's being represented in the matter. So that you have leadership controlled or leadership oriented control, an authoritarian leadership approach is central to group identity, where individuality is deprived and surrender or autonomy towards cultic personality traits manifest themselves. The first thing I will hear when somebody calls me for help is the personality change that they've seen. It's different than the natural maturity process that people go through as individuals. That tends to be spontaneous, it's individual. The personality change that families experience when I'm called in to work with someone is an induced personality change. So the induced nature of that change relates to the processes of the group. The teaching is one part of it. You believe what you're being taught. The other part is the process of how did this change come about. So when you're surrendering individuality, that's the individual person's autonomy that's related to that. One of the sides of authoritarian leadership is compliance to that authority. When you have compliance in behavior to the authority, the relationship to other people can be affected by that. Inside the group, they all have this common ground of this doctrine that they believe with one another, and they have that in common. I've seen people get married in groups like this. They don't actually love each other, but they believe it's God's will that they be married because of the group teaching. And the group teaching is set up, you have to submit yourself to somebody who's over you. And they choose, or they say yes or no, to whether that relationship's going to continue. Many of them will not permit dating. They have, in fact, the Maranatha group that was mentioned, they had what was called a no dating revelation. So if you dated someone, that was considered sin. The next effect of this, if you're dealing with just complying and open, is if you question, that's doubting. Versus what the Bible says about critical thinking. Test all things, prove all things, hold fast to that which is good. 1 Thessalonians 5:21. in 1 John 4, beloved, believe not every spirit, but test the spirits to see whether they're from God. One of the things that's very healthy about the spirituality in the Bible is that critical thinking is encouraged. And one of the words that's used about think on these things, I believe that's in Philippians, the root word is logizomai. Now if you go into the Greek, some of our English words have its derivation from that. In fact, the medical community, the legal community, certain professional communities use the history of both Greek and Latin in their terminology. Theology, study of God. Anthropology, study of man. Logizomai relates to thinking. Think on these things logically. So the Bible does encourage logical, critical thinking. And in Isaiah, and I'll touch on the verse in my PowerPoint, is come let us reason together, says the Lord. It's very important to dig into the root Hebrew word behind that word. And it's encouraging because when you're dealing with authoritarian structured groups, they undermine these biblical checks and balances that would protect you from being deceived. Not only that, but it addresses the fear or the intimidation that the person might feel. God's going to punish me for being disobedient. God's not going to be pleased with me because I've challenged, I didn't do something proper in relationship to my leader. So the molding capacity can be very powerful when you're looking at this. Okay, I have stuff on the screen here, so let me look at that. It relates to the exit counseling work. The background information within a relationship to a group like this is important for me in terms of anyone that calls me, because there's two sides to it. There's the personal side of the person's history and their family, and there's also the group or the organization and its history and how the person relates to that. So you really need to evaluate how do those two interact with each other. And so it's very boundary sensitive when you're talking about how do I sort out what's appropriate for me if I get involved. And so what I look for if I do become involved in an intervention, are we dealing with induced changes? They're not natural changes. And I'll tell you why that's important. This is America. We all have our First Amendment rights and other rights in the United States Constitution. So when we're dealing with adult individuals, what's to stop them from saying, what right do you have to interfere? I take that seriously when someone says something like that. So the foundation for me getting involved has to do with, am I responding to something legitimate? When people call me, I'm getting a call, versus I'm not recruiting a family to get business from them. That's not what I do. I'm responding to issues that come up in the relationship when they change in a way where there's ethical issues that come up that need to be addressed in communication. So if you're dealing with the personal transformation issue, you need to know the distinctions between natural changes, which any adult goes through as they grow up, and respecting family privacy and all that, versus a group that is harmful, and there's induced changes that's causing harm in that relationship and harm to the family in the sense of the impact that it has. So I feel it's appropriate on an ethical basis to respond to those things. So the amount of time that the person's been in the group is a big factor because of the process relationships that they have. As you get more into a group, the indoctrination becomes deeper. The closed-mindedness that I described at the earlier part of the presentation is related to what is it that you have to confront. Now, there's an interesting other side to this. The longer the person is in, they're seasoned. They see not just all the good that the group wants them to see and just believe it. They see other things going on. The critical part of that is when they see other things going on, how do they process those other things? What I find is when people are trapped in it, especially when it's totalist, you don't have a legitimate alternative. You're stuck. And that's the power that the totalist group has over that, is that you believe this is the ultimate truth with a capital T, This is God's best. I mean, I remember in my group, there were like jokes about God's green beret. We were like the green beret of God. So, you have a certain elitist attitude, and especially when the spirituality is taught in this elitist kind of way, you're not going to go to the church down the street. You're not going to get involved with the missions agency that needs help, maybe Samaritan's Purse or something of this nature. You tend to stay within the group terms and concepts. You tend to be committed to that. So the seasoned veteran sometimes is easier because they can see the other stuff. The honeymoon phase is the person is like a young child in the arms of its mother, trusting that authority relationship that they have that's protected. And so if I try to say, well, are you aware of this, that, and the other, the person doesn't even know what you're talking about. If you were to go to a modern, say, Jehovah's Witness and go through the history of false prophecies, many of those younger people wouldn't even know what those prophecies were during the time that they were given, and they failed, and they wouldn't have that full history about it. It'd be very difficult to talk to them. So it's a matter of what you can access and be able to process, where you widen the thinking. Now, the biblical foundation for this is very helpful if a person can see that there's a legitimate way. 1 Thessalonians 5:21 or Acts 17:11. The Bereans were more noble-minded than those in Thessalonica, for they searched the scriptures daily to see whether these things were so. So the authority from God to examine this without being spiritually punished is a very important thing. Not only that, but you have to deal with the fear element. I don't want to hear this. I might be possessed by Satan at this point. I could be spiritually compromised. I could be, that's a serious psychological and spiritual thing when you're reacting in that way. That's why verses like I'm sharing with you, beloved, believe not every spirit, but test and try the spirits. For many, false prophets have gone out. So you have to know what the Bible refers to as the spirit of truth and the spirit of error, and being able to discern between the two. So small unknown groups, for example, when I hear about them initially, it requires a lot of research. Now I showed you the PowerPoint slides. Quite a few of those groups, I have a lot of information about that. So I can easily address the group because I know a lot about it, and in many cases I have a lot of experience with them. Other groups are small and you have to do research to the point where the information is sufficient to make a sound judgment how to address it. And I would say if you're dealing with organizations that aren't transparent, in other words, what they teach, what they believe, many of them would claim to be 501c3. In other words, you have even public records concerning contributions, for example. Many of the groups that I deal with that are protective and cult-like, they tend not to be transparent. They will only tell you what they allow you to know at a certain time window. That's the way that tends to work, versus total transparency where you meet, you can go to the library and see the books. I mean, there's a difference between the way those two dynamics work. And so the real nature of personality change observed by family members, and what were the exact circumstances that led to these personality changes? That's a critical thing in terms of my relationship to how to address whether that needs an intervention or not. Okay. So in terms of the thought reform consultation, I need to tell you the background of that terminology. Robert J. Lifton studied brainwashing in China. He was part of our military professional doctors who worked with our soldiers who had been captured by the communists. And so in chapter 22 of his book, he wrote about the 8 psychological themes, and I'll put the list up on PowerPoint, the 8 psychological themes of what constitutes mind control or brainwashing. And he calls it thought reform. And his book is Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism. So, in order to address the induced nature of personality change and induced nature of thought reform, it's really important to get at what were the building blocks that caused that process to work the way it did, especially when it reaches that totalistic level, especially when it hits that aberrant level. So I'm dealing with 2 things. I'm dealing with the psychological, sociological, but I'm also dealing with the theological, the biblical stuff. that relates to anybody that's been in the Taka group. So, former members have been some of our best sources of information. Mark and I recently went up to Alaska earlier this year and had a conference there. Speaking with the former members, I learned things about people that were in my group in Alaska that I didn't know, living in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, because a whole group of them left New England to go to Alaska. So I was updated. Here I am, over 30 years, and I'm finding out personal things about a friend of mine that got married in this group situation. So it's interesting how you learn certain things, but former members have been an incredible source. They tell you what's going on the inside. That's kept from outsiders. You know, what the insider sees is not what the outsider sees. And so you have that, what's called esoteric gap. There's a gap there. And it's important to address that information, but responsibly handling it is the big thing. You know, if it's premature, and a lot of families do this, and I just experienced one in Chicago. I would call it the dump truck approach. And what I mean by the dump truck approach, the internet is a powerful tool. And people pull out all this stuff, and they go to somebody that's active in the group, and you need to read this, you need to look at this. Guess what happens? Not only won't they vet all that stuff, they tell the leadership, oh, this is what my family gave me. Guess what happens? You've just alerted the group. And now they are really going to have, you're like in a holy war. It's the only way I can describe it. It gets difficult. So I would recommend, if you have any family members or people that you really care about that are still in situations like this, that information has a tremendous value to it. Timing is important. What's important about the timing is their ability to hear it. So in my process, I work through the family history. And in the family history are the stepping stones of that process of change. The common ground that they all had together, now you're seeing this change. What brought about that change? It's a questioning relationship, not an accusing one. The thing with, think of Joan of Arc. Do you remember what happened to her when she was captured? She was in enemy hands as far as they were concerned. This was, you know, the whole war that was going on between the Protestants and the Catholics back then. So if the person feels like Joan of Arc, guess what the attitude's going to be? Viva la France. They're going to be committed to the loyalty of what it is they believe. So persecution is a very sensitive topic when you're dealing with something like this. And the main thing about I would say the approach to trying to reach, and I find it's this effective, is relating to what's important to them. Now that doesn't mean you agree, and you're not communicating in a deceptive way that you agree with things that you don't. I'm not recommending that. What I am recommending is that what's important to them, it's an area